afternoon. My name is Pete Tseronis. Welcome to the episode of Industry Insights, where today you're going to hear from three incredible folks, and I might add in a little bit of color, but our guests today represent a tapestry of wisdom that spans telecommunications, products, solutions, in a space that we believe is relevant to today's topic, but also as consumers and users of electricity, energy, power, water, the utilities that we need in our life. And today we're going to talk about spectrum. We're going to talk about some topics that seem complex, but we hope will educate, inform, and like we say, enlighten a bit your curiosity or spawn some curiosity as to why you should care about these topics. Topics including private LTE, citizens broadband radio service, spectrum in general, and maybe a little bit of background on the energy sector as well. Thanks to Anterix for bringing the community together. I worked in the United States Department of Energy for 8 of my 25 years. I run a company called Dots and Bridges, where frankly, I like to tell stories, introduce facts, create some light bulb moments, and I am truly honored to facilitate today's call or web call with my colleagues Richelle, Mauricio, Dr. Mauricio, and Michael Ahrens. So with that, I'm going to brag a little bit about our guests, tee it up, and then each of my colleagues will introduce themselves. And like most people, not probably want to brag about themselves, but trust me, go read about them on LinkedIn. Richelle Elberg is the Principal Research Analyst at Guidehouse Insights, formerly Navigant. If you've read any of Richelle's material, or in this case, Guidehouse's material, it's awesome. It's comprehensive, it's agnostic. I encourage you to do that. 30 years in this business, in the industry that spans the evolution of communications pre-internet and post. Before joining Guidehouse, Richelle served as the Director and Senior Analyst at JSI Capital Advisors. She's an expert in wireless communications. I've served on panels with Richelle. I have all the respect in the world for what she brings to the table in terms of conversations and just providing some of those light bulb moments. So Richelle, we're super excited to have you here today. In the lower half of this web call, if that's the angle you have, we have Dr. Mauricio Subieta, who is amazing and hails from Nokia Corporation. He's an incredibly talented, gifted, academic, techno geek, and that's a compliment. But he focuses on everything from cybersecurity and solutions, private LTE, engineering, telecommunications, and you just have to look at his advanced degrees. He is a PhD in computer engineering, awfully impressive, as well as electrical and computer engineering masters, not candidate, but masters, if you will, in terms of his degree and his pedigree. So Mauricio is really an operational technology kind of guy who understands the impact that information technology is having as our grid specifically is modernizing. So Mauricio, your insights are going to be practical, but also tangential to the future state of our grid. And last but not least, we have my colleague, Michael Ahrens, who I have known for years. Michael and I go back to the day when the internet was really showing up on desktops. He is an experienced engineer. He's had an incredible track record around the telecom networking arena. He works for Federated Wireless, which is a company that is developing shared spectrum, Cbrs capabilities, again, a term we're going to use today. He understands the partner ecosystem, but most importantly with Michael, he too is a storyteller. He's worked with folks who live in data centers. His experience with that evolution, if you will, is one that I hope you take away from today, which is, why do I care about any of this? And what does it mean to me if I can't see it, feel it, or touch it? And that's Wi-Fi, that's spectrum, that's grid spectrum. That's the stuff we just think works, but when it's not, we kind of panic. Hey, we're having a hurricane here on the East Coast and tropical storm, and a lot of people today have been worried about that. And that's when I think it hits home, if you will, where we all should understand why the sectors deemed most critical in our country, for example, energy, depend on and are emerging with this telecommunication underpinning. So with that, I'll stop sucking a little air out of the call and introduce again Richelle. And Richelle, why don't you tell some folks a little bit about your journey and your passion and why you like to talk so much and write so much about this very topic.
Sure, and thank you for having me. And I was just thinking when you went through my bio, it is almost 30 years now that I've been an analyst of one form or of one technology or another. So when I started out, I was looking at radio and television broadcasting, pretty old school stuff, but cable TV was the big thing. This was the early 90s. But what I realized, and a point I think that's worth making here today is that, you know, back in, I guess it was 92 or 3, my boss came to me and he said, I want you to head up our interactive multimedia research, which was basically the internet. Now, my experience up till that point had been over dial-up. And I was like, this internet thing sucks. You know, it was slow, you lost the signal, it was horrible. So fast forward 10 years or so, 8 years, and I had become our wireless industry analyst. And I remember being at one of the annual CTIA meetings in New Orleans and hearing one of the speakers say, someday everyone will have 3 devices. It'll be 300% wireless penetration. Now, back then, my company was accused of being aggressive if we suggested penetration might hit 25 or 30% of the population, right? So the long-winded point I'm trying to make here is that I think when utilities look at their networking needs today and the connectivity solutions and the different choices they have, they need to take that long-term view. They need to realize that they don't know what they don't know yet, and they don't necessarily know how critical it might be 10 years from now. So I'll stop there. That's my number one takeaway regarding utility connectivity solutions.
Yeah, and thank you, Richelle. And again, for the audience, you know, the unknown unknowns is what's exciting and nerve-wracking. We're not here to say the sky's falling. We're not here, as we pivot over to Dr. Subieta, to talk about, hey, there are cyber and physical risks as we evolve, but it is what it is. The world is converging, right? And I think, Richelle, your term, or you know, the interactive multimedia, that's the world we live in, digital communication. So, you know, Mauricio, comments you can build into your intro. But again, Dr. Subieta, we're excited to hear a little bit about your journey and passion.
Sure. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share this medium with all you guys, because you're truly experts in your areas. And, you know, I'm humbled to be been asked to participate, just maybe to bring a little bit of my experience and share with you the path that I've actually followed. So I've started working, like you said, in the actual technology, in the actual field, setting up networks, designing networks for oil and gas and companies that actually do resemble quite a bit of the utilities, infrastructure. And then I ended up working in an electric utility and supporting not only the networking, but also the cybersecurity portion of it, which you were just bringing about. And I think when I joined, it was a path that took me to bring a converged network to the utilities, which back by then were really leading with legacy technologies, you know, single purpose networks, and that actual headache that meant dealing with all that. And we're talking about wired networks, right? And as I saw the evolution of the utility moving into the wireless side, using all kinds of technologies, basically the same thing was happening over again. So you just went from learning a lesson of how not to set up separate networks in the wired world to do it again in the wireless world, which was a pain. And obviously the conclusion was, well, we have to converge. And that, I think, brings us to the fact that we're here now looking at these technologies like you introduced about, you know, LTE and using bands like Cbrs, which back in the day, were not even thought of being able to reach this type of segment, or, you know, being participant within utilities, either water or gas. It was just crazy to think that. Well, now it's a reality. The market is basically driving towards having those technologies, and now bringing cybersecurity to the mix is also something that is very important. So that's my path. That is what I've seen. So I hope that with that, I'm going to be able to help a little bit during the conversation today.
Well, Mauricio, you will, and you introduced, CBRS, again, Citizens Broadband Radio Service. I have some cheat sheet notes here, but Citizens Broadband Radio Service will be one of those topics we'll dissect. 900 megahertz spectrum. You know, this year were some pretty important dates on the calendar. I believe it was July 23rd when the auction kicked off for Cbrs, and then back on May 13th with the 900 megahertz, availability now to utilities to leverage that band. That'll be part of our storyline. Again, a audience that we can help weave some of this story together for you. Pivoting over to Michael. Michael, again, I think it's a little bit about this journey where you too understood those initial, the ping power pipe world of the network, why it's important. And now we're, to Mauricio's point, looking at the wired network isn't, it's just a complement to the wireless world. But it could be scary, it could be challenging, but resilience is something we're building toward, right?
Agreed. And I've wanted to also just stress that I'm honored to have been asked to join this. I'm looking forward to a great discussion with all of these luminaries in our respective fields. And I guess I'm thinking about, we've kind of recounted our own journeys, and I'm thinking about mine. And it started right around the times that they were hauling the punch card machines out of the data centers. I kid you not, right? So we were going from the glass house days in the 1980s to a few years in, there was this thing called interactive multimedia that Richelle talked about before. I saw NYU start a program in it. I was interested in it, but my cousin actually went to do it. And at that point, the internet did suck, and it was kind of, you kind of wondered what the relevance of it was. But a few years later, my cousin answered that. He has like 2 or 3 Emmy Awards now for productions he's done on National Geographic, and he's worked for other media companies running their web presence. So we've gone from the glass house, everything consolidated, just data, to splitting things apart, to deconverging, and then reconverging again, as Mauricio was saying, with cloud, right? We went client server, then cloud after a couple of attempts, and here we are now. And throughout that entire time, I've done software development, I've done systems integration, I've done pre-sales, and I'm in an operations role now, and the common theme has always been communications. That's always been the passion for me. And my career has been sort of an elevator ride up and down the ISO model, right? So right now I'm sitting, I started at layer 7 and I've plunged down to layer 1 right now. But
Hey, let me interrupt. We're going to say things like that, ISO. We may use words like Cbrs. We may use words like frequency versus frames versus packet switch. I'm going to caution, if we say something like ISO, let's assume nobody knows what the heck we're talking about. But no, that stack that you talked about, Michael, is what most people, if they Google it, will see is how data is transmitted, how we secure it, how it's presented on a device. So significant to the spectrum discussion. So I had to just say, if we say acronyms, I may interrupt and go, tell them what that stands for.
No, my bad. So thank you. And I'll just end by saying, why the passion around communications, and I'll just point it out today. And it's not just about communications, it's about energy. And I mean, just look at where we are with the pandemic the way it is. There's a lot of disruption in the employment market and in the general economy as a whole. But were it not for the communications infrastructure and the energy infrastructure as it is now, I think it's arguable that our entire economy would have collapsed as a result of this, because folks are able to work at home and continue to do these sorts of things, even with the restrictions in place, and we're together we're finding a way to manage this instead of be crippled by it.
Okay, well, let's take that and let's sort of package it. I'm going to come back to Richelle here, and again, the rule of thumb is if there's a comment, it's not a scripted dialogue. I think a lot of folks will have comments on a lot of the topics. And Richelle, you write a lot. You talk to a ton of people. If I can offer as sort of a foundation for today's conversation is we're going to use critical infrastructure quite a bit. We're going to talk about utilities, which doesn't just mean energy. Think water, think wastewater, think telecom, right? Yes, and energy is one. There are 16 sectors in our country that are deemed most critical by the Department of Homeland Security that require policy oversight, but the owners and operators of that infrastructure are generally private industry. And the relationship with public and private sector to have the dialogue, to move the pendulum, to secure our assets, to get excited about convergence also requires, I think, us to dispel myth about the sky isn't falling, but bad stuff happens, to Michael's point. Think of acts of God, think of disasters that unfortunately, Katrina, and places like Superstorm Sandy or Fukushima, we realize in the case of our country, at least with Katrina, our telecommunications were not resilient. Resilience is not reliability per se. It's how do I recover quick enough to get people back to life or save lives. So I offer that as a little footnote. Richelle, you've seen this over decades, like the constant excitement of evolution at LTE, which is a hot topic right now. What are you finding people are most excited about and concerned about from a utility perspective?
Oh, there's so much.
Yeah, just want to pick one that, you know, you hear a lot.
Well, you know, the industrial IoT, this concept that heavy industry and critical infrastructure needs to be digitized and connected. You know, that's not necessarily a new idea, but I think it's snowballing just now for a variety of reasons. You know, the increasing storm severity, you referred to the storms, the fires out west. It's a real need, but I think that need, and so that resiliency and security of the network, of the grid, is vastly important. But beyond that, there are economic changes going on. There are competitive shifts happening in the marketplace. So, you know, if Tesla is going to offer me solar and charging for my EV all in a nice package, and I can cut off El Paso Electric, if I can save money, I'm going to do that. And so the need for connectivity goes beyond just optimizing the grid and making it more resilient. It's a competitive need, or it will become one over the next 10 years, say. And I think a lot of your question was, what are people most excited about, or what are they not like? And you know, they don't like the cost, and utilities are highly regulated, but I would argue, and I witnessed the downfall of the wireline telecom industry, and this was a monopoly business, and who in the 90s thought that our cell phones would actually replace our landline? How many in today's audience actually still have a landline? I'm not saying exactly that same thing's going to happen to utilities, because there are many differences, but there are many similarities. And when you think about all the new technologies coming along, utilities have to progress or they will suffer. And unfortunately, some of the worst offenders in terms of not thinking strategically long-term like that are the regulators. And so in some cases, utilities' hands are tied. But when it comes to spectrum and connectivity, it's foundational. It's a must-have. So however you need to do it, there are spectrum options available today. The regulators are coming around in certain progressive states, and the others will follow. So it's not a nice to have, it's a must have, in my opinion.
And just
well said. And really quick, just to close out, you know, the option that utilities have now, your must have gives people choice, right, Richelle? It's not, I must have a private LTE network or a public.
No.
It might be good.
You just must have very good connectivity.
Yeah.
And I think that goes to the fact that, you know, like Richelle is saying, the actual utility mentality and the business itself is changing, right? So she brought a good example about renewables, and renewables are shifting completely the utility paradigm from being a top-down model where you actually used to have a company that would basically sell all of this product, right? It's really a monopoly where you actually have and you sell everything you produce. It's great, obviously regulated, to a place in which now you have competition from your own customers, right? You're actually having wind farms, you're having solar farms, and now regulation and legislation is telling them, well, now you have to play together. Well, utilities own the assets. Utilities are actually having to deal with the actual distribution of it all. And now that you have to deal with a different model altogether, from being the sole producer and seller of that product, now you're becoming a broker of that product, right?
Right.
And to be able to be a successful broker, you have to be able to get communications everywhere, but not the communications that used to put, in the last 10 years with the smart grid, trying to get meters to be automatically read, or trying to get a little bit of distribution automation to make sure that you are providing a better product to your customers by reducing outages, by actually, meeting those indices that utilities have to meet in order to be showing that they're doing the great job, like KD and safety. Those are actually moving towards, now we have to meet the requirements that these people are reselling their product or are selling part of their product, and we have to have really low latency networks, really mission critical.
Correct. So Mauricio, let me pivot over to Michael and provide some feedback on that, because Mauricio introduced the term prosumer, if you will, consumers of and users and creators of, which are no longer just utilities. We as
Networks that are able to capture that without making it blow it all up.
Right. So Mauricio, forgive me, we were just pivoting off some of your comment about the introduction of the stakeholder involved with consuming or providing energy in our country isn't just our utility anymore, right? You can put a solar panel, you can have an electric vehicle, and I think that integration speaks to sort of that complexity of where wireless comes into play. Michael, I'm interested in terms of just these comments, private LTE, why is it important? What are some of your thoughts based on what you're listening to?
Right. So especially as more of the grid gets distributed, right? Like Mauricio said, we've got wind, we've got solar, we've got all of these different types of things scattered all over the place that are now part of the grid itself. In order to connect them all, in order to be able to manage them and turn them on and make them available, you need to have a communications infrastructure that doesn't require you to dig up the ground, because it's about speed, it's about agility, right? Everybody is trying to deliver service faster. And the thing about Cbrs and the basis on which private LTE going forward is based is that it does offer a rapid access to a type of spectrum where there's range and quality that you don't have with other forms of unlicensed wireless communication. So this is almost on demand. If you think about it, you are able to provide spectrum at a relatively inexpensive cost, right? Just pretty much for the infrastructure itself, for what we call general authorized access spectrum as part of Cbrs. The spectrum's just there for you to use, and you use it when you need it and you take it down. So it's dynamic, it's available, and it's high quality, and it can be deployed quickly and simply. And I think that in terms of delivering any kind of the service, anything that provides that kind of agility is a good thing.
Yeah, and again, for our audience and each other, the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, it's a 150 megahertz wide broadcast band of 3.5 or the 3.5 gigahertz band. For those who want to go Google, where is it? Why do I care? What does it look like? Some of the features that Michael mentioned, there's a purpose for it. There are opportunities with the auction underway to take advantage of, and I think that speaks back to what everybody's saying, and Richelle introduced, is if you're a utility, if you're a consumer, if you're a business, if there's an opportunity to leverage this communication medium, think about what problem you might be trying to solve, or what problem you may currently have, and how something with better agility or faster speed, or if you're going to be in a remote environment like we're living in today, we depend on broadband. And let's not get quite yet into the fact that we on the East Coast and West Coast have all the broadband we need. There's parts of our country that still have dial-up, if that. So This is a problem that isn't to go down to Best Buy, buy a device, plug it in, and say, I'm smoking with data transfer. Let me go back to Richelle, and maybe we'll just go with this rhythm, the group. Cbrs, private LTE, some of the features and capabilities. What could you, putting on your professor hat, we'll start with maybe this time, let's go to Mauricio and then pivot up to Richelle. Why should somebody be excited about Cbrs, and why should somebody be excited about 900 megahertz and what it can do for their business?
Sure. And like Michael said, I think one of the key enablers about Cbrs is that it's open to everybody. You don't have to actually go through an auction process. You don't have to go to the FCC to register and follow that cumbersome procedure that actually happens for anybody that has to deal with wireless communications, right? There are mechanisms now that allow you to basically get your infrastructure going. Use companies like Federated Wireless, for example, to provide the spectrum access management of the system. And off you go. You use it when you need it, and basically becomes something that was really needed in the industry, a portion of spectrum that is not necessarily assigned to a very specific use case. And that's really the key word there, the use case, right? Because the use case is what determines how you can apply certain technologies or use certain technologies to meet the requirements. So in talking about critical infrastructure industries, and specifically with utilities, like, in the fact of trying to modernize a utility business, some of the use cases that pop up do have certain requirements, some stringent requirements about latency, for example, or availability, like you said. So I think that while Cbrs is a very good option to enable communications, some of the use cases, unfortunately, are not necessarily met with this technology the way that utilities need it. So we look now at special spectrums like 900 megahertz, the actual ruling that the FCC just came up with, because it is the spectrum. It may not necessarily be as much of it available as the Cbrs, but it meets that requirement of being specific to certain use cases that require that latency, that require that reliability, that require that resiliency, obviously with proper network design, that make it another option that actually now meets those use cases, right? So the key is to understand the use cases and how much they actually fit one of the other technology, where both Cbrs, or spectrums, I should say, where Cbrs and 900 megahertz do have a very a good position to be played out as complementary to each other, right?
Yeah, no, great point, Richelle. I'm gonna feel free to respond to that, but I don't really have maybe more of a statement that you can riff off. Is this education of the smart grid. You introduced the topic of the industrial Internet of Things, right? There's the Internet of Things, which we know are the billions of devices that are connected by an IP address, and it communicates, and that's cool. That's why we can do so much globally and be connected. And then there's the industrial, which you get into different types of protocols, which is where like 3GPP comes in and what they're doing to work with radio access networks and the like. But connectivity and utilities today, Richelle, I'm just looking at some smart meters, smart grids, the power lines, the issues that we saw with PG&E, where it's a physical, challenge that caused something to, let's call it what it is. People died because there was a physical infrastructure that, due to weather and all those things that you could say is a perfect storm, really said, hey, we have to mitigate that, God forbid, and it will happen again. What are you finding in your writing and in your discussions with how, what is exciting? There's the opportunity to be more resilient by having more data and more information at the fingertip to predict what could happen. Are you finding that people are embracing this concept of smart grid?
Oh, absolutely. But it's interesting, the buzzwords change, but the underlying real meaning doesn't change. So 10 years ago, smart grid meant smart meters, basically. And the government, provided stimulus that jump-started that, and utilities deployed all these smart meter networks, and many had already done so, but it was that economic stimulus that really pushed it over the tipping point, say. But today, utilities, they say, well, hey, wait a minute, we've got this network, goes all the way out to the grid edge, all across our territory where we have customers, and why don't we use it for this? Why don't we use it for that? We can monitor our transformers, we can monitor voltage and power quality and all these other things. And meanwhile, the technology is coming down in price. So you can buy a sensor today for, well below the pricing levels that utilities might have seen even 3 or 4 years ago. What I think is exciting, I just finished writing a report. I don't remember the title precisely, but it talks about the LTE family of protocols. And that's what's so cool about this whole, it's coming together in a perfect storm in a good way right now, because we have, for the first time since I've been following utilities and their connectivity needs, so I'm 8 years, there are spectrum options. There literally was nothing available for utilities to practically own spectrum or lease spectrum. There just hasn't been any. So now we have both Cbrs, which can be accessed on an unlicensed basis, or you can buy the priority access license through the auction that's going on right now. Or if you are taking many IOUs in particular want to own and control their network. And so they're going to be more interested in the private spectrum option or leasing that spectrum in the 900 megahertz range. It all works. And as Mauricio said, it's complementary. But then, don't just think of that network as one LTE network, for example. You can use narrowband IoT, much less expensive if you want to put sensors everywhere for asset management and predictive maintenance. There's LTE Cat M1, which is a little faster and a little more expensive. And then there's LTE Cat 1, same thing, a little faster and a little more expensive. So there's a range, a family of LTE-based technologies, which, by the way, are all evolving and coming together and will become 5G as 5G specifications are finalized and the technology matures. And so that's really the nirvana, I think, for whether you're a utility or a manufacturer, or whatever industry you might be in. That's where you want to be heading, and you can do it incrementally, especially with the Cbrs, the GAA license, the general authorized access portion of that spectrum can be accessed without payment. So it's a great time for a utility to be embracing this industrial revolution, I guess.
I love it. Michael, go.
Okay. So to that point, I want to make a little bit of a distinction. So we've talked about Cbrs, right, and its complementary nature to 900, right? But at the end of the day, what is spectrum for any use case, right? It's range, its speed, its quality, right? And all of those determine the cost of what it takes to build infrastructure, right? And the speed at which you can do it certainly factors in. But what I think is making the paradigm of today so unique, and what is making Cbrs so unique, is that it is a spectrum sharing approach. In other words, the band was there and was used for other things, but the technology that Federated Wireless makes enables customers to share that spectrum, which has that particular quality of range and speed and quality, right? All of which support things like 5G, any 3GPP type of infrastructure. But the bigger picture that I think needs to be painted is that it's not all just about Cbrs. Cbrs is just a small chunk of that spectrum. There's lots of other spectrum that could be subjected to that sharing paradigm, right? So folks talk about C-band, right, which is the part of the band that's just above Cbrs. And there's portions of the military band that are just below Cbrs that are candidates for this type of spectrum sharing model, which could also, which provide different combinations of range and speed, right, depending on the use case, and can deliver it rapidly and really foster agility in not just the utility space, but everywhere.
Yeah, no, Dr. Subieta, and just talk about that range, speed, quality triangulation. I mean, we can wax poetic. I had some notes here on, why private LTE or Cbrs matters. You get into like, you have to have, what's your technology that you plan to leverage on that spectrum? What is it that you're going to use the information for? And, Michael, military use, there's probably consumer use. And while there's a lot of decisions that go in, and there's no one will just give them to you. But I think this idea of as the world's changing at Nokia, for example, think of the complexity where how do I know what I need? How do you help people get to that point? Because everybody uses critical infrastructure. Everybody can say, oh, wow, you want to have choice. People might want to say, other than non-private LTE. I come from, you should have a complement. How do you work with customers to help them get to that decision with, as my wife always says, just give me the information so I can make a decision. How are you finding that dialogue?
Well, I think the dialogue really starts from the fact of what we talked earlier in this conversation, which is convergence, right? We talked about the convergence of several wire networks into a single one, and the same is happening right now.
I'm losing a little bit of Mauricio there. When he jumps back in, we'll go ahead and grab your video. Yeah, buddy, your video is a little
now with the wireless networks. And so a lot of the actual use case, a lot of the need. So yeah, what I was saying is that the actual need comes from convergence. And I guess let me see if I can fix my video feed. And why don't you go to Richelle while I do that?
You work on that. Let me pivot up to Richelle a quick minute. You know, Richelle, the technologies that are available are it's massive in terms of options. Do you have a use case, or do you have a referenceable, story or an exemplar that you've heard that shows how, hey, there's a little bit of risk involved, but there is a utility or two that are really embracing this private LTE expansion?
Well, it's early days, as you know, with the FCC ruling only having come back in May. But there, even prior to that ruling, Ahrens announced that it was doing a trial with Anterix 900 megahertz spectrum in its Missouri and Illinois territories. And it has a whole laundry list of applications it's planning to implement. So, I mean, I don't have any statistics as far as, oh, we saved X dollars, because it's going to take time for that to all prove out. NIPA is also has announced that it's going to be building private LTE, and it has a long list of use cases. So it's everything from asset management, predictive maintenance, maybe smart metering, can be substation automation, sensors and throughout the distribution grid, and more.
Yeah, and I'm going to just riff, and again, it was a great example, and you went even further than I thought with an actual company. I just thought like the hypothetical of, and you just pointed out a great one, and I'm going to add on to that, as we welcome Mauricio back. Coverage, reliability, uptime, security, application variety. What you can do with a private LTE network as your primary or secondary or tertiary. What you can potentially do if you're the right suitor for or of Cbrs. That's the promise. And I do believe we're moving into where spectrum is becoming part of the dialogue. That if you're a company or a consumer or you're a government agency, I mean, there's the NTIA on the government on this side, and I challenge a lot of our audience to should care, because you are in some cases, not just a consumer, but a prosumer. So thank you for that. Michael, do you want to talk about some excitement, whether it's hypothetical or what you could say is the art of the possible, in terms of, 5 years from now, how Cbrs or private LTE is?
Well, so I think that quite honestly, the different use cases are endless. I mean, you can see applications for it in, we've talked about utilities, but certainly in distance learning, certainly in medicine,
medicine,
hospitals, right? Things like you can't afford to have, the pixelation and things like that we're seeing even here on this conference. Not being critical, but it's a good example. You can't have that happen when you've got a patient on the table. Right. So it's really about having the right tool, right, the right set of range and speed and quality available to you for the particular use case that you need. And really, you name it, you know, you can do it. We're looking at customers in retail. We're looking at customers in the hospitality industry, transportation. Really, anywhere that you can see a point of sale or a point of interaction with a customer where, you know, where that experience matters. The ability to set up something like that quickly on demand, it's really irreplaceable. You think about the possibilities ahead. Just the whole notion of sensors everywhere, right? That's a use case that's evolving, and I think that we'll see private LTE evolve, you know, along with that, to overtake, I think, what the biggest current use of CBRS is right now, which is fixed wireless, right? But, you know, rural broadband. So really, it's hard to reach a limit. You know, all I can say is that we're working with lots of different customers and lots of different integrators to pull together solutions for all of these industries and deliver it as a service. And I think that's really one of the things you're going to see evolving as well as a consequence, is that more things will be available as just as a service on demand.
So let's pivot back to, and thankfully our friend Mauricio isn't performing surgery on Michael, like we're a little nervous with this video choppy, but it goes to a perfect example of nothing's perfect. We're weather and bandwidth, and not everybody has the same stuff on both ends. I do want to get though to Nokia, and I want to give a shout out. I'm a big fan of how critical infrastructure, you know, through technologies power cities. Smart and connected city, right? There's a talk about smart cities, and it sounds really cool. I'm the chairperson for the utility supercluster, and I like to talk about how some countries internationally and nationally are leading the way of embracing this convergence. That being said, Mauricio, the cybersecurity, physical security expert, people say, "Ooh, not in my backyard." How do you address the promise of property or CBRS or smart grid with, you don't have to be fearful because there's no silver bullet, but you can mitigate risk, cybersecurity implementation? What do you say to that when the cybersecurity discussion happens?
And yeah, unfortunately, with any field area network that you have, you're going to have a problem of how exposed you become by increasing your attack vector, because you now are in the public domain. However, the technology itself, LTE, and moving forward with 5G, just as a normal, regular evolution, has mechanisms that actually have been taking that into account from their very origin. So encryption, authentication, and validation of who you really are, and, you know, non-repudiation, it's called in the cybersecurity world, are already embedded into the technology. So the technology itself is very secure. How you implement it obviously depends, and how much thought you put into creating a different levels of defense are going to be the ones that make sure that your infrastructure is going to be as invulnerable as possible. Obviously, that is not perfect, and it's never going to be. But I think technology, it's in a point in which now you can feel safe enough that if you do and you follow best practices, you're not going to have an impact within your infrastructure that could deter or basically in any way impact your performance and the network performance, such that you're not going to be discouraged through that. So.
Yeah, let me just chime in, and then we'll go to Michael, and then Richelle, please chime in if this is some topic that comes up with you too. I'm sure you've written about it. Is references, okay, best practices, as Richelle pointed out. There aren't every utility in the world embracing 900 megahertz and or CBRS, and saying this is why it works so well for us. Everything's unique. Let's leave it at that. However, the cybersecurity framework, which our own National Institute of Standard Technologies puts out, I encourage you to go to nist.gov, search on any topic, and there's some best practice guidance, special publication. The National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence out in Gaithersburg, Maryland, is doing great work with industry. I encourage industry to involve themselves where they can, but also 800-160 specifically at NIST. It's special publication, SB 800-160, I think they're on revision 2, speaks to building security and engineering it into your products. And if you're at Nokia or you're at Federated Wireless or Anterix or Dots and Bridges, there are referenceable best practice guidance documents we should all be taking advantage of. I see a lot of head nodding because, again, to Richelle's point, she pulled one out, which was a, hey, there's some people excited, but people want to say, at least I referenced something that said, if I'm going to deploy an IIoT network and I want to have resilience built in with private LTE, I at least can say that if I'm doing it or somebody else, I want these best practices implemented. So I just wanted to give a shout out to our good friends in the federal government out at NIST. Michael and then Richelle, some comments on this cybersecurity topic.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on what Mauricio was saying about, and it kind of ties into what you were talking about too, best practice, right? Consistency is key, right? And one of the things that private LTE and any 3GPP-based technology brings is, along with it, is not just the built-in technology, but an ecosystem that understands it, right? So that you have consistency for how you implement. And that's, you can't overstate the value of that. That's all I was going to say.
Okay, Richelle, do you have any insight on, do people bring this up a lot? Do you write a lot about the cyber implications of a smart grid?
Well, a colleague of mine actually is more of our cybersecurity expert. I will just say this, there are always concerns about the security of technology. Back in the day, people were afraid of cell towers. They thought they were going to get brain cancer. Today, people are afraid of small cell sites, and the same worries. At the end of the day, the benefits of the technology outweigh the risks. There are always going to be hackers, and I think it's pretty tough to make something 100% invulnerable, but the technology is awfully good. And as you point out, as long as you follow best practices and stay up to date, which is important, you should be fine.
Yeah, and again, I didn't mean to say cyber. I should have used the word security, because again, for our audience, there's cyber and physical security. There's the stuff like you use cameras for to watch the house. Cyber, to your point, Richelle, you were awfully eloquent. So shout out to your company for having a cyber expert. But shout out to you. Yes, shout out to you for, hey, maybe this can be our pivot into the new oil that I like to refer, and has been said, not by Pete Tseronis, data. Data, information with value is, or data with value is information. We've touched on IoT, we've touched on innovation, we've touched on telework environments, working remote, dependence on communications. For a minute, let's assume there is broadband and there's connectivity. The power of data cannot be underscored enough to help companies obviously secure their assets, drive revenue. This discussion about data and information being predictive and prescriptive with all the IoT and the smart this, that, and the other. Mauricio, can you talk a little bit about data becoming the asset that maybe back in the day was just a bunch of ones and zeros, but now it's revenue generating oil?
Oh, yes. And that goes to the point of the utilities paradigm completely changing from being the sole provider of service or product to being a broker. And you cannot be a broker if you don't have data, right? The data is right now the actual most important asset, I would say, in the utilities hand, because it allows you to your point, to go and be predictive in the sense of maintaining their infrastructure, having a clear view of what's happening near real time, but also it becomes a transactional entity in which now you bring technologies like blockchain, for example, in which you are really getting all that movement of who is producing, who is sending it where, with the distributed energy resources, for example, and now you have a good methodology to keep track of that. So data now is really the basis of how a utility works, and most of other industries, if you think about it. And in some cases, there's even a deluge of data. So now you are bringing data scientists as part of the actual staff in the utilities, because now you have to make sense of all that information, because not only is what that information brings individually, but also what that information brings as a whole. When you determine patterns, when you can actually look at the whole data all together, that big data analysis that was so big a few years ago, that actually is becoming.
Still is.
Well, now it's changing the name now, actually. You know, as everything just tends to evolve, now you have different names for it. And the idea is that information is relevant to a point of being critical to utilities that used to be not before, right? So that whole data that it's getting transmitted, generated, and distributed around that grid is the day-to-day business of the utility now, I would say.
Richelle, can you talk a little bit about this? Because again, data, if those of you who are tracking, listening, watching the federal government, its tenets for its agenda around technology focuses on IT modernization. It makes sense. Data accountability and transparency, right? To make decisions with all this wonderful digital communications. What do we do with the data if we can't make sense of it? And that's where the data science comes in. And then lastly, I love, and touched on by everybody, but the 21st century workforce, the utility workforce, which is ingenious and great and probably can tell you how they were doing things 100 years ago if somebody's still living, and they're still probably doing it today because it works. What an opportunity to leverage data to create a more resilient utility. That's a great piece you just spoke to, and I just wanted to try to capture some of that. Richelle, what are the discussions around data, good, bad, or indifferent with regard to this new technology roadmap?
Well, it's a paradigm shift, no question about it, and for the utility industry, and so collecting that data, storing that data, cleansing that data, making sure the data is accessible across multiple departments and systems. These are big challenges. The utility. If you think back to the Glenn Campbell song, "The Lineman," right? The lineman for the county. It was a very physical, mechanical industry, and the data was maybe in a spreadsheet, but probably on a piece of paper. But today that you shift that on its head. And then the great thing about the new technologies, it really improves safety. When you talk about not only in utilities, but like I wrote a report on mining not too long ago, and networking for mining. You know, the big mines are already, they've got driverless trucks, they've got robots, you know, they're keeping more people safe. And I think the same thing is slowly happening in the utility industry. But getting back to your question, you know, the data drives the analytics, or AI, as everyone likes to say now, but it's really just analytics. The names change and the buzzwords shift, but it's an evolving but very exciting technology. I think utilities are very excited about what they can do with analytics and all that data, but getting there is a process, and this doesn't happen overnight. So they're their way through.
Yeah, no, and a great point. And I'm going to just, again, speak to those awesome comments about, you know, AI, another term, artificial intelligence, the machine learning, you know, making sense of that data, and what an opportunity. And there's always two sides, right? It's, I want the insights, but I want the security. I want to be in my private little network, but I don't want to be one. And where does the two meet? And I just hope that for our audience, that this whole education, it's incumbent on you as a business owner, if you're a consumer just interested in what your utility's doing with your data, to just investigate, but know that everybody is trying to do so that you have that insight, whether you're a consumer or business, and keeping that data safe is critical. I'm going to pivot to Michael on something, just because I know he can speak to this, and I hope it resonates. And then for our audience, we're going to pivot into the parting shot session. So Dr. Subieta and then Richelle, you get to think about what's that comment or tweet you want to leave with the audience about today, and I'll have one as well, and I'll tee it up one more time, but start those neurons firing. Michael, volume, velocity, and variety of data, right? The cloud, 2009, introduced. Oh, we can put everything in the cloud. Okay. The veracity of data, though, is what is, nobody would argue, is there's just so much of it. How do I consume it and make sense of it? Can you speak to being a network engineer, telecommunications, guy that wants to probably put dashboards on C-suites? What are your thoughts on that evolution of, you know, volume, velocity, variety, but now veracity of data?
Well, you know, it's kind of funny. Quite honestly, I was just dealing with a situation about that this morning, right? So you're hitting a spot right now. But quite honestly, again, it goes back to the whole notion of agility, right? If you can't believe the data, you can't be agile, right? But let's make an assumption that there is a way to ensure the veracity of that data. The availability of it, the ability to get to it, where you need it, when you need it, it's fundamental to making strategic decisions and tactical decisions as well. So, you know, you can't, it's another thing that can't be overestimated.
And it's an opportunity, though, is what I'm at least hearing, is the power of data. Again, is data with value. You have to have the AI, right? Dr. Subieta, you have to have the infrastructure to process that data. And the human being is not being replaced, in my view, anytime soon. I think we have something on data and machines, and that's a brain, the most powerful computer. I am in that corner. But I think how we complement the robots and the ones and zeros with that is significant. Okay, the fun part. I hope that was good for you, Miss Richelle, because I'm going to finish with a takeaway, everybody, but we're going to give you the floor here. What is it? Question: if somebody said, you know, Richelle, why should I have this topic? What is it that you would say and would want to leave with the audience?
Well, my parting shot is don't worry about the cost. There's a lot of, I think, concern that, you know, not only do you have to, in some cases, pay to access spectrum, but you also have to build the network and you have to maintain the network. In the long run, the future value creation is going to far outweigh the cost. I think you should go for the best, most expensive network you can afford if you're a utility. And it's not only about new value creation, it's about value preservation in a more competitive environment. So that's my parting shot.
I love it. If you were listening, value creation leads to value preservation. That is resilience, but in a cool way of saying it. Love it. Dr. Subieta, parting shot.
I think it is very important to keep a lookout on what's coming down the pipe. And what's coming down the pipe, the Industrial Revolution 4.0, where automation is going to be king. And that is going to be reliant on the technology that Richelle was speaking about, being state of the art. He's going to talk about in the veracity of the data that Michael was talking about, in how you manage that throughout AI and machine learning, and being able to actually manage what you just said. It's all that is going to require a human being that still has to make sure that we have the final decision on it. But it's going to change the world significantly. We're there. We're actually starting the steps there with 5G. That is going to lead on this new revolution, the Industrial Revolution 4.0. And that's what we're looking for as the next, I would say, greatest next thing coming down from technology.
Well said. Automation, innovation, convergence. It's exciting. I love that riff off of our friend Richelle here. So well done. Parting shot, Mr. Ahrens.
I'll keep it real short. Spectrum sharing means agility, right? And agility means that you can perform and make better decisions, you know, no matter what you're doing. You know, I know we're talking about a very vertical thing, but what the spectrum allows is it's a very horizontal problem, right? Making information available to people who need it when they need it at a non-prohibitive cost. So.
Awesome, punctuated. I'm going to finish with tying together. First of all, a thanks to our guests, Richelle and Dr. Subieta and Michael. You're all amazing. We'll do this again for sure. Anterix ready to kind of bring us together and have this dialogue. And those of you who tied in, watch this again. There was a lot of information, a lot of nuggets, which will hopefully cause neurons to fire a bit, because you should be involved in the discussion. I'm going to close with spectrum is the most critical infrastructure, in my view, that we have in our life, in our world. Richelle talked about some examples that and as did Dr. Subieta and Michael, that address, you know, we want to secure infrastructure, we want to create healthy environments, we want to save lives, right? Natural disasters happen and bad things happen. spectrum is the way we're going to communicate. So whether it's a plane, a train, an automobile, a dam, a water, a wastewater, a chemical sector, learn about those sectors that are owned and operated. You have a role, whether you work for one or you depend on one, to know what they're doing to innovate. And the wisdom from Richelle and Mauricio and Michael today hopefully provided some of those light bulb moments. So we will do this again. We thank you for your time, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.